"Don't move a muscle," Mountain Man whispered to his trembling, obese bride what he actually needed. "Don't move a muscle." The words came out low, deep, and commanding, the kind of voice that could freeze the wind mid-howl. Charity Willowbrook stopped breathing. Her whole body went rigid, her eyes wide, her heart pounding like a drum trapped inside her chest. She thought he was angry. She thought the hunter she'd been forced to marry, the man who could track a ghost through snow, was about to show her what real power meant. But outside, something moved. A shadow crossed the window, heavy, silent, and close. The sound of soft, padded steps pressed against the earth. Then a deep growl rolled through the night, vibrating through the cabin walls. "Don't breathe too loud," Nate whispered again, his hand raised slightly, not to threaten her, but to protect. His eyes, dark as wet bark, flicked toward the door. "There's a mother grizzly outside. She's got cubs." Char's lips trembled. I thought you meant—" "I meant stay alive," he interrupted softly, gaze still fixed on the window. The air in the cabin felt carved from glass, still, fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest sound. Somewhere in the dark, the bear's claws scraped against stone. Char clutched the edge of the table, tears glinting in the firelight. And yet, for the first time since her wedding, she realized something. This man wasn't her captor. He was her shield. When the growls faded and the night went still again, Nate finally turned to her, his tone gentled, almost human. "You did good, Char. You listened." But she didn't answer. She just stared at him, the man everyone called Shadowhawk, and wondered if she'd ever learn to read the wilderness that lived inside his eyes. The morning after the grizzly's visit, the forest woke before the sun. Mist rolled low across the pines, and dew hung on every blade of grass like silver breath. From outside the cabin came the soft scrape of a knife against wood, a sound that belonged to a man who had already been awake for hours. Char stirred under the wool blanket, her eyes heavy but restless. The smell of pine smoke and coffee drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls. For a moment, she almost believed she was back home, in her parents' house near the river, where the only sounds were roosters and gossip. But then she saw the rifles on the wall, the pelts, the traps, the reminder that she now lived in the heart of nowhere with a man who could disappear into the forest like breath into wind. Nathaniel Shadowhawk was not what she expected a husband to be. He didn't speak much. He didn't ask questions. He moved with a kind of patience that came from years of tracking prey, each step quiet, measured, deliberate. The townsfolk whispered that he could read animal prints like words in a book, that he once survived a whole winter alone with nothing but a knife and a wolfskin cloak. Char, meanwhile, had never even lit a fire without help. When Nate returned from outside, his boots were wet, and his hands carried 2 rabbits, still warm from the hunt. He dropped them onto the counter, his movements efficient, unbothered by her silence. "You sleep at all?" he asked without looking up. "Barely," she admitted. "Every sound out there feels like it's coming for me." He glanced at her then, a brief flicker of sympathy crossing his rough features. "It's not. The forest doesn't hunt people unless people give it reason to." She hugged herself. "And what about the people who live in it?" That earned her a half smile, barely there. "Depends what kind of person you are." For days their rhythm fell into something wordless. Quiet mornings, cautious afternoons. Char watched him work, repairing traps, sharpening blades, skinning hides. Every movement was clean, efficient, strangely graceful for a man built like stone. At night, she lay awake listening to the forest speak, the crack of branches, the cry of an owl, the distant rush of a stream. But what unnerved her most wasn't the sound of the wilderness. It was the silence between her and Nate. One evening, while she stirred stew over the fire, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely out here?" He didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, he said, "The forest doesn't talk back, but it listens. That's enough." Char frowned. "And I'm supposed to get used to that." He met her gaze for the first time that day. "You'll learn, just like everything else." His words weren't cruel, but they struck something deep inside her. The same place that remembered the laughter of townsfolk who said she was too big, too soft, too slow to survive on her own. Maybe they were right, or maybe she'd prove them wrong. Later that night, when the wind pushed against the shutters, she found herself repeating his words silently. "You'll learn." And she decided she would, even if it meant learning how to read the heart of a man who lived by the laws of the wild. The first lesson began at dawn. Nate handed her a rough wool cloak and a pair of boots, 2 sizes too big. "We're going out," he said simply, already strapping his rifle to his shoulder. Char blinked sleep from her eyes. Out? Into that? She gestured toward the mist-heavy woods where the trees seemed to swallow the morning light whole. He didn't answer, just opened the door and started walking. So she followed. The forest was colder than she expected, the air sharp with pine and earth. Every twig that cracked under her boots sounded like thunder. Nate moved ahead of her without a sound, leaving barely a trace in the dew. "Step where I step," he said over his shoulder. "If the ground looks easy, it's probably not." Char frowned. "You make it sound like the forest is testing me." "It is." They climbed for an hour before Nate stopped beside a stream. He crouched low, studying the mud near the bank. Char followed, out of breath, and noticed faint marks, barely visible indentations. "What do you see?" he asked. "Nothing," she admitted. "Just dirt." He pointed. "Look closer, the way the grass bends, the weight of the print. That's a doe and her fawn. Passed through here not 20 minutes ago." Char leaned closer, squinting. When she finally saw it, the faint outline of a hoof, the pattern of broken moss, she gasped. "How can you tell all that from so little?" "Because I learned to listen before I looked." It was the first time he'd said something that sounded almost philosophical. As the days passed, the lessons continued. Nate showed her how to identify edible plants, how to read the direction of wind by the way pine needles turned, how to tell whether an animal was hunting or fleeing just by sound. At first, Char stumbled through every exercise. She tripped on roots, tangled her skirts in briars, and cursed under her breath when a branch whipped her face. But each time she faltered, Nate was there, silent, patient, never mocking. "Again," he'd say, "slower this time, feel the ground before you move." He taught her how to walk softly, how to balance her weight, how to breathe in rhythm with the forest. By the end of the second week, she could move through the trees without scaring away every bird within a mile. One evening, they camped beside a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The sun was sinking, painting the trees in molten gold. Nate knelt by the fire, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. Char sat across from him, her hair loose, her cheeks flushed with the day's climb. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted quietly. Any of it. You did, he said simply. You just had to stop fighting the forest long enough to hear what it was saying. She smiled faintly. And what does it say to you? He stirred the stew once, then looked at her. Really looked. It says, not everything worth keeping has to be tamed. The words sank into her like warmth spreading through cold bones. For the first time since she'd met him, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. When the wind shifted, she heard the faint cry of a wolf pack in the distance. Nate lifted his head, listening. They're hunting, he murmured, but not near us. You can tell by the pitch. Char shivered, not from fear, but awe. You really can hear everything, can't you? He smiled then, a rare, quiet thing that softened all the sharp lines of his face. Not everything, he said, but sometimes I hear you breathe. She turned away quickly, pretending to check the stew, but her cheeks burned in the firelight. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called, low and mournful. The night had found its rhythm again, and so, it seemed, had they. Winter came early to Whispering Pines. By mid-October, frost clung to the window panes, and the forest beyond the cabin looked like a frozen sea of silver and white. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and inside, life took on a quiet rhythm that neither of them dared to break. Nate rose before dawn each morning, his silhouette framed by the pale glow of the hearth as he sharpened his knives or mended traps. Char would wake to the smell of coffee and venison stew simmering on the stove, his way of saying good morning without words. At first, she still felt like a guest in someone else's world. The walls were lined with trophies of his past hunts. Antlers, pelts, feathers. But slowly, her presence began to soften the place. She hung dried herbs by the windows. She repaired torn curtains with fabric from her old dresses. She even coaxed a small patch of wildflowers to grow near the porch, defying the frost. Nate never commented on it, but one evening, as he returned from checking the traps, he paused by the door and said quietly, "Smells like home in here." Char looked up from kneading dough and smiled. Maybe it finally is. Over the next weeks, they fell into an unspoken partnership. She cooked while he chopped wood. He repaired snares while she tanned hides. Sometimes they spoke, small things, practical things, but often the silence between them said more than words ever could. Once, while showing her how to split firewood, he stood behind her, guiding her hands on the axe handle. "Don't fight it," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Let the weight do the work." The log split cleanly in two. Char blinked, half startled, half proud. "You make it sound easy." He gave a faint grin. "It is, when you trust the swing." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the air between them felt charged, not with fear, but something gentler, slower, far more dangerous. Later that night, as snow fell outside, they sat by the fire. Nate cleaned his rifle while Char mended one of his shirts. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly, the small scars that crossed his knuckles. "How many winters have you spent up here alone?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. 15, maybe 16, stopped counting after the war. "And you never thought about leaving?" "Every winter," he said, "but the forest always gives me a reason to stay." She hesitated, then asked, "And this winter?" He finally lifted his gaze. "This winter's different." The fire popped softly, sending sparks dancing upward. Char didn't need him to say more. She felt the difference, too, in the way he moved around her now, slower, gentler, in how he lingered by the table after dinner, pretending to check his gear when he was really just listening to her hum. One evening, after a blizzard sealed them inside for 3 days, Char caught him staring at the window, restless. "You hate being trapped, don't you?" she said. Nate nodded. "The woods keep me steady. When I can't move, I start to think too much." "About what?" He hesitated. "Things I've lost." She rose, crossed the room, and set a hand lightly on his arm. "Maybe some things are meant to be found again." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm howled outside, but inside, the only sound was the quiet crackle of fire and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning how to share the same silence. That night, when Char went to bed, Nate remained by the fire until the embers turned to ash. He watched her sleeping from across the room, her face soft in the glow, her breathing calm, the sound of peace he hadn't heard in years. For the first time since he'd buried his own past beneath the trees, Nate Shadowhawk realized the forest wasn't the only thing worth protecting anymore, and somewhere deep in his chest, the hunter's heart began to thaw. The thaw came late that year. When it finally did, the rivers swelled with snowmelt, and the forest woke from its icy sleep with a chorus of dripping water and restless wind. The change brought a fragile peace, but also something else, something that didn't belong. It began with footprints. Nate found them one morning near the northern ridge. 3 sets of boots, heavy, deliberate, too clean to belong to trappers. He studied the tracks silently, his jaw tightening. Whoever they were, they'd moved like men who knew how to hide. When he returned to the cabin, Char was sorting herbs by the window, sunlight spilling across her hair. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, noticing the shadow on his face. "Not ghosts," Nate muttered, hanging his rifle. "Hunters!" She frowned. "Hunters? Like you?" He hesitated. "Not the kind that hunt animals." That night, Nate stayed awake long after she'd gone to bed. He cleaned his guns twice, checked every lock, then sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they could burn away the memories pressing in on him, the faces of men he used to ride with, men who killed not for food, but for coin. The next day, Char noticed how he kept glancing toward the tree line, his shoulders tense. When she asked, he said little. But later, when she stepped outside to fetch water, she found a small rusted tin buried near the porch. Inside were old papers, military dispatches, bounty contracts, and a faded photograph of Nate in uniform standing with a group of soldiers. Across the back, someone had written Shadow Unit, 1878. When Nate found her holding the photo, the silence between them cracked like dry ice. "You went through my things," he said, voice low. "I didn't mean to." "You looked." The words came sharper than a blade. Char swallowed hard. "I had to. You've been different, quiet, watching the woods like they're full of ghosts." Nate's chest rose and fell, his hands curling into fists before he finally exhaled. "Because they are." He took the photo from her and stared at it for a long time. "Those men, they weren't just soldiers. We were bounty hunters, government contracts. They sent us to clear outlaw camps in the mountains. Said it was justice, but it wasn't." He paused, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "We killed people who didn't deserve to die, families, and when I tried to stop it, they turned on me. I barely made it out alive." Char's heart clenched. "And now they've come back." He nodded. "They always come back. Loose ends don't stay loose." The next few days were heavy with tension. Nate began fortifying the cabin, reinforcing shutters, setting traps along the perimeter. Char helped without question, though fear coiled tight in her chest. One night, as wind howled through the pines, she whispered, "You saved me from the forest. Let me save you from your ghosts." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the old soldier vanished. In his place stood a man who wanted desperately to believe in peace. But peace never lasted long in the wild. 3 nights later, the intruders came. Char woke to the sound of crunching snow and muffled voices outside. Nate was already on his feet, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he whispered. But when the first gunshot shattered the night, Char didn't stay. She crawled to the window and saw 3 figures moving through the trees, rifles glinting under the moonlight. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "They're circling. 1 to the left, 2 by the creek." Nate glanced at her in surprise. "You saw that?" "I listened," she said, echoing his own lesson. "The forest told me." He almost smiled. "Good girl." Then he chambered around. "Now let's make sure they never forget it." As the men crept closer, the hunter and his unlikely bride stood shoulder to shoulder, her courage matching his steel. And for the first time, Nate Shadowhawk wasn't fighting alone. The first shot shattered the silence of the forest. A crow burst from the treetops, wings slicing through the cold air as snow drifted down like ash. Nate moved with terrifying precision. Years of instinct took over, his breath steady, eyes sharp as he tracked the movement between trees. But beside him, Char was no longer the trembling girl he'd once found in the woods. She crouched low behind the firewood pile, her hand steady on the rifle he'd taught her to load. "Left ridge," she whispered. "He's moving fast." Nate didn't question her. He fired once, clean, controlled. A man's cry echoed and fell silent into the snow. Then came 2 more. The woods erupted into chaos, gunfire, the hiss of bullets striking bark, the guttural shouts of men who thought they were hunters, not realizing they'd just walked into the den of something far more dangerous. Nate barked, "Char, stay down!" But when one of the intruders broke through the clearing, she didn't freeze. She swung the rifle around, remembered every lesson, breathe, aim, trust the swing, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed against her shoulder, but the man fell before he could raise his gun. Nate turned toward her, eyes wide with disbelief. "You—" "I listened," she said breathlessly, "like you taught me." Before he could answer, the last man shouted from the ridge, "You can't hide forever, Shadowhawk. The past always collects its debt." Nate stood then, stepping into the open. "Then come and take it." The echo of his words bounced across the mountains, low, final, absolute. The last shot rang out, not from the ridge, but from Char. The man fell, his rifle tumbling into the snow. Silence. The forest exhaled again. Only the crackle of their dying fire remained. Nate lowered his weapon, chest heaving. When he turned to Char, she was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "You did good," he whispered against her hair. "You saved my life." She clung to him, tears freezing against his coat. "No, you saved mine long before tonight." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "We're even, then?" "No," she said softly. "We're home." As dawn broke over the mountains, the forest glowed gold again, as if the land itself was blessing what it had witnessed. Not a battle of war, but of redemption. For the first time in years, Nate Shadowhawk lowered his guard, and beside him, Charity Willowbrook, the woman once too afraid to move, stood tall, her hand steady, her heart unshaken. The hunter and his wife had both survived the wilderness and each other. The storm had passed. A hush settled over the forest. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that comes after survival. Smoke rose gently from the cabin's chimney, curling into the morning air. The snow around it was marked by footprints, trails of struggle and victory now half buried by the wind. Inside, Nate sat by the fire, his arm bandaged, his rifle resting by the hearth. Char knelt beside him, carefully pouring hot water into a tin mug. Her movements were calm, practiced, no longer the uncertain hands of a frightened bride, but the steady touch of someone who had learned how to live on the edge and not fall. "You should rest," she murmured. He looked up at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "You sound like you own the place." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I do now." Outside, a wolf howled somewhere deep in the valley. Nate's gaze drifted toward the sound, not wary, just listening. "They'll stay away tonight," he said quietly. "They can smell peace." Char chuckled under her breath. "Does peace even have a scent?" He reached out, tracing a scar along her wrist, one she'd earned cutting through brambles weeks ago. "It smells like wood smoke," he said, "and bread, and the woman who keeps me alive." The fire cracked softly between them. Char leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time, she didn't flinch at the sound of thunder rolling in the distance. She didn't see danger in every shadow, only life, wild, unpredictable, beautiful. "You're safe here," Nate whispered, "for as long as you want to be." She closed her eyes, smiling through quiet tears. "Then I guess I'm home." Outside, the forest stirred, alive again, waiting, and somewhere beyond the trees, the wind seemed to ask a single question. When the wilderness calls again, will love be strong enough to follow? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded of how stories connect us, across miles, across lives, across the quiet spaces between hearts. Maybe you've never stood in a forest like Char, or faced the ghosts that hunted Nate. But all of us have known fear, and the hope that someone might stand beside us through it. If you believe that love can grow even in the wildest places, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And don't leave just yet. The next story might be the one that finds you.